Good Monday morning and welcome to TWINN number 64, where 5 minutes or less, I will share with you some topics that we really need to be paying attention to. But let's first talk about antivirus software today. Now, long gone are the days when we can just freely sit down at a computer and just make productive use of it to dream, to build, and to sell helpful products and services. Now, the increase in productivity was obvious early on to entrepreneurs all over the world, but also to those who would, for personal gain, commit a crime at the drop of a hat. So today, we live in the reality of endpoint protection software or antivirus software having to have the most intimate access to the space inside of our devices so that it can detect and respond to threats. The part that is usually glossed over is that we inherently must trust such an organization to treat the private and confidential information in a way that would hopefully never be betrayed. For example, endpoint protection or antivirus software can theoretically access your banking passwords and your multi-factor authentication tokens. But would it? Would they? Probably not, because there is inherent motivation in keeping the trust. But this is the reality of the trust factor that is applied to such a business relationship. Now, remember how a few years ago, Kaspersky out of Russia was banned from being a vendor to the United States government? That may or may not have been justified, depending on which narrative we go with. But here we go again, but this time it's Germany warning against the usage of Kaspersky. Now, this is on the basis of a threat that the Kremlin could force Kaspersky to open access to the level of endpoint detail that Kaspersky has to necessarily collect in order to provide effective protection. In turn, such endpoints could theoretically be threatened by using that trust relationship that is paid for to protect themselves. So, for what it's worth, Kaspersky has never been a preferred vendor with us, but sadly, I don't know that we'll ever know the truth of what happens there. In our next story, we read a good news story about how California is building the nation's first privacy police. So we are celebrating this initiative, absolutely. Considering that California is where the world's largest tech companies are headquartered that make use of private data collection, we're glad to see this initiative. And the FBI is a little upset that companies have to first report all hacks to the Department of Homeland Security within 72 hours, but the DHS does promise to immediately share such reports. This all makes sense in light of today's geopolitical climate. And Sandworm Advanced Persistent Threat is now utilizing ASUS routers with a botnet called Cyclops Blink. And as far as consumer and prosumer routers go, ASUS has had a better reputation on the security front than most. And while it appears that default credentials have been used in this attack, the reality is that most modern ASUS routers force you to go through the setup, so there is no default credentials. So the attack may be limited, but it's also very easy to patch this by just clicking on a link in your router's firmware update link in its administration page. And another router story about why TrickBot is using MikroTik routers to ply its trade in many countries around the world. MikroTik is the dominant router that's supplied by internet service providers. And it makes sense that when a router like a MikroTik, which is powered by Linux variant, is hijacked, it makes a very powerful jump box for attackers. But most importantly, it's because it can easily evade all the typical threat detection schemes. Not in a zero trust approach, but if you're relying on MikroTik itself to provide the protection, and this is an easy way to evade that. And did you know there might just be some light at the end of the password tunnel? There's a big bet by the FIDO Alliance to kill the password for good, but let's see if this ends up being any more adoptable than Squirrel, which is already freely available. Take care and see you again next week.